The story of Nora Haskett is not one of sudden violence or a single, definable tragedy. It is a story of quiet erosion, of a terror that seeped into the marrow of a family, not through a shattered window, but through the closed bedroom door of an 8-year-old girl. In the year 1863, in a small, God-fearing town in the Ohio River Valley, the Haskett family lived a life of unremarkable virtue. The horror that found them did so not with a roar, but with a whisper, and its greatest power was its victim's inability to convince anyone it was real. Nora could not explain what was in her room, because to do so required a language her world did not possess. If the obscure corners of history are where you feel most at home, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, subscribe to this archive so that these lost records may always find you. The Haskett house stood on a modest plot of land just beyond the main township, a simple but sturdy timber frame structure built by the hands of Nora's father, Thaddeus. It was a home that smelled of baked bread, drying lavender, and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke that clung to the curtains and the woolen blankets. Life within its walls was governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the steady, comforting rhythm of domestic ritual. Thaddeus was a carpenter, a man of quiet disposition whose pragmatism was etched into the lines around his eyes. He believed in the logic of wood, the certainty of a well-placed joint, and the solid, irrefutable reality of the world he could touch and measure. His wife, Elspeth, was a woman whose strength was of a softer, more resilient kind. Her domain was the hearth, the garden, and the spiritual well-being of her family. She was protective, deeply so, and her world revolved entirely around the health and happiness of their only child, Nora. They were good people, respected by their neighbors for their industry and their piety. Their life was a testament to the belief that if one lived correctly, with humility and faith, the darker aspects of the world would pass them by. Their home was a fortress against uncertainty, its timbers a bulwark against the chaos of the war that raged in the distant south and the more intimate fears that lurked in the shadowed woods and whispered folklore of the valley. Nora, at 8 years of age, was the singular focus of their world, a bright and inquisitive child with hair the color of autumn straw and eyes that held a serious, watchful quality. She was, by every conceivable measure, a perfectly ordinary girl. She had known no great sickness, suffered no significant trauma, and had never been prone to flights of morbid fancy or bouts of melancholy. Her imagination was active, but it was the wholesome imagination of childhood, manifesting in the elaborate histories she invented for her cornhusk dolls and the solemn funeral rites she performed for fallen birds found in the yard. She possessed a unique and quiet habit that her parents found endearing. She collected smooth gray stones from the creek bed that bordered their property. Each one was chosen for its perfect, unblemished surface. She would spend hours polishing them with a soft cloth before arranging them in precise, evolving patterns on the sill of her bedroom window, a silent, orderly testament to a mind that sought pattern and peace in the natural world. This was Nora Haskett, a child grounded in the simple, tangible realities of her small, protected life. There was nothing in her history, her character, or her daily habits to suggest she was a vessel for the unnatural. The foundation of the Hasketts' world was solid, built on the bedrock of reason, faith, and the predictable unfolding of the seasons. It was a foundation they believed to be unshakable, an assumption that was about to be tested in the most profound and terrifying way imaginable. The terror did not arrive with a storm or an omen. It began, as so many unsettling things do, in the quiet light of a new day, over a breakfast of porridge and milk. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the air outside carrying the first crisp suggestion of autumn. The routine was inviolable. Thaddeus would read a short passage from the Bible, Elspeth would serve the meal, and they would eat in relative silence, the comforting domestic sounds of spoons scraping against earthenware filling the small kitchen. It was into this placid atmosphere that Nora introduced the first crack in their reality. She had been pushing the food around her bowl, her expression distant. Elspeth, noticing her daughter's lack of appetite, asked if she was feeling unwell. Nora shook her head slowly. She told her mother that she had not slept well. She said an old woman had come into her room during the night. The statement was delivered with such simple conviction, so devoid of childish drama, that for a moment, neither parent knew quite how to respond. Thaddeus placed his spoon down with deliberate care. He asked his daughter what she meant. Nora looked at him, her gaze direct, and explained that a woman had crawled on her hands and knees from the darkest corner of the room, the one by the tall, unadorned wardrobe. Elspeth's first instinct was maternal and soothing. She reached across the small wooden table and touched her daughter's hand, telling her that it was only a bad dream, a common thing for children to experience. She reminded Nora of the story they had read the previous evening, a folk tale involving a mischievous old crone who lived in the woods. She suggested that the story had likely planted a seed in her mind, which had then sprouted in the darkness of sleep. It was a logical, comforting explanation, and Elspeth delivered it with the gentle authority she always used to dispel her daughter's minor fears. Thaddeus, for his part, approached it from a more practical angle. He told Nora that the large oak tree outside her window often cast strange shadows when the moon was high. He explained that the branches, swaying in the wind, could look like all manner of things to a mind that was half asleep. He said the house itself made noises at night, the groans of wood settling, and that these sounds could easily be mistaken for something else. He was not dismissing her experience so much as recategorizing it, placing it firmly within the realm of the rational and the explainable. It was a dream, a shadow, a sound. It was not real. But Nora was insistent. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. She told them it was not a dream. She had been awake. She was certain of it. She said the woman was not from any storybook. She was grotesque, her skin loose and gray like damp clay, and she wore a dress that was little more than dark, rotting rags. Nora said the woman had not walked, but had moved with a horrifying, scuttling motion, her knuckles and knees scraping against the wide pine floorboards. The sound, she insisted, was real. It was a dry, scratching sound, like a dog digging at the door. And there was a smell, she added, a smell like turned earth and damp cellars, a scent of things that had been buried for a very long time. The most disturbing detail, however, was what the woman did when she reached the side of the bed. Nora's voice dropped to a near whisper as she recounted it. She said the woman had not tried to touch her, but had simply stayed there, on the floor, her head level with the mattress. She had looked at Nora with eyes that were cloudy and pale, and she had whispered her name over and over, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across stone. The name, her name, Nora, spoken with a sibilant, breathy hiss that was both intimate and deeply menacing. The woman did not threaten her, did not touch her, did not do anything more than whisper her name in the suffocating darkness. Thaddeus and Elspeth exchanged a look over their daughter's head. It was a glance that conveyed a shared, unspoken agreement. This was a child's fancy, born of an overactive imagination and the deep, suggestible quiet of a country night. To treat it as anything more would be to give it power, to validate the fear and allow it to take root. They had to be firm, but gentle. Thaddeus adopted a tone of finality. He told Nora that he would hear no more of this nonsense. He assured her there was no woman, that her room was perfectly safe, and that she was letting her imagination run away with her. Elspeth reinforced his words, telling Nora to finish her breakfast and think of the pleasant things they would do that day. They would bake a pie, she suggested, and perhaps take a walk down to the creek to look for more of her special stones. They presented a united front of parental certainty, a calm and rational wall against which their daughter's strange story could find no purchase. They believed they were doing the right thing, cauterizing a small wound of fear before it could become infected with obsession. For her part, Nora fell silent. She did not argue further. She simply lowered her gaze to her bowl and complied, but her parents mistook her silence for acquiescence. They did not see the deep, lingering terror in her eyes, nor did they understand that her inability to make them believe was, in its own way, as frightening as the memory of the crawling woman herself. The conversation was over, the matter considered closed, but for Nora, the day was merely a short, sunlit intermission before the darkness returned, and with it, the certainty of her visitor. That evening, the familiar rituals of bedtime were performed with a slightly forced sense of normalcy. Elspeth sat by Nora's bed a little longer than usual, humming a gentle lullaby and smoothing the covers around her small frame. She made a point of checking the corner by the wardrobe, declaring it to be entirely empty and safe. Thaddeus came in to say his good nights, his presence large and reassuring in the small room. He spoke to his daughter about the day's work, about the chest of drawers he was building for a family in town, grounding the conversation in the solid, sensible world of his craft. They lit the small oil lamp on her bedside table, a concession to her lingering unease, promising its gentle glow would keep all bad dreams at bay. When they finally closed her door, leaving her alone with the flickering shadows and her collection of silent, watchful stones on the windowsill, they felt they had successfully managed a minor childhood crisis. Downstairs, as Elspeth tidied the kitchen and Thaddeus read his newspaper by the fire, they spoke of it briefly. Thaddeus reiterated his belief that it was the product of a restless night, nothing more. Elspeth agreed, though a sliver of maternal anxiety remained, a quiet, nagging worry that was as formless as a shadow. She told herself that all children had nightmares. It was a phase, a passing cloud. By morning, she was sure, it would be forgotten. They retired to their own bed later that night, the house settling into a profound and peaceful silence, a silence they mistook for safety. They did not know, could not have known, that in the room down the hall, their daughter lay awake, her body rigid beneath the covers, her eyes fixed on the darkest corner of the room, listening. She was listening for the first faint, scratching sound of knuckles and knees on the wooden floor, a sound she now knew was not born of dreams. The dismissal by her parents had not banished the woman, it had only ensured that when she came, Nora would have to face her alone. The quiet of the Haskett home was no longer a comfort, it was now a canvas, waiting to be filled with a terror that only one member of the family could see, and the nightly visitations, far from being a singular event, were only just beginning. The second night was a near-perfect echo of the first, a circumstance that, for Thaddeus and Elspeth, initially served only to reinforce their conclusion. A child's mind, having conjured a frightening image once, could easily conjure it again. They were woken shortly after midnight by a sharp, piercing cry from Nora's room. It was a single, desperate sound that sliced through the deep stillness of the house. They rushed to her bedside, their own hearts pounding with the residual shock of being pulled from sleep. They found her sitting bolt upright in her bed, her small body trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to be focused on something just beyond their own perception. She was pointing a shaking finger toward the corner by the wardrobe, a space now filled with nothing more than the dense, impenetrable shadows of the night. She told them, in a choked and fractured voice, that the woman had returned. This time, however, the visitation had been different, more malevolent. The whispering of her name had been replaced by something far worse. Nora claimed the woman had spoken curses to her, vile and incomprehensible words that felt like filth in the air. She could not repeat them, she said, but she could feel them, a cold and heavy weight settling upon her spirit. Thaddeus, his patience already thinned by the hour, was firm. He lit the larger lamp on the dresser, flooding the room with a warm, steady light that banished every shadow and revealed the simple, unviolated space. He strode to the corner, running his hand along the wall and tapping the floorboards with his foot, demonstrating their solidity, their absolute emptiness. He told Nora that he was losing his temper with this game. He declared that there was nothing there, that there had never been anything there, and that she was allowing a silly dream to frighten not only herself but the entire household. His voice, usually a source of comfort, now carried a hard edge of frustration. Elspeth, though she shared his desire to end the charade, felt a pang of unease at his tone. She saw the genuine terror in her daughter's face, a terror that seemed too profound to be a mere performance. She took a gentler approach, sitting on the edge of the bed and drawing Nora into her arms. She whispered soothing words, telling her she was safe, that it was over now, that it was only a figment of her imagination. Yet, as she held her trembling daughter, she could not ignore the coldness of Nora's skin or the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart. It felt, disconcertingly, like the aftermath of a real ordeal, not the fading phantoms of a dream. They stayed with her until she finally drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, her breathing punctuated by small, whimpering sounds. Back in their own room, Thaddeus expressed his conviction that this was becoming a bid for attention, a childish stratagem to be the focus of their concern. He reasoned that perhaps she had overheard them speaking of a neighbor's child who was ill, and was subconsciously manufacturing her own ailment to garner similar sympathy. It was a clinical, almost detached assessment, but it was the only one that his rational mind could accommodate. Elspeth did not argue with him. She wanted to believe him. The alternative, that their daughter was being visited by some unseen entity in the sanctity of her own bedroom, was a thought so monstrous, so contrary to the ordered world they had built, that her mind refused to grant it entry. She allowed her husband's logic to be a balm on her own rising anxiety, and they eventually fell back asleep, the silence of the house once again restored. But for Elspeth, sleep was no longer a place of true rest. Her dreams were troubled, filled with vague images of dark corners and the sound of dry, whispering voices she could not quite understand. The pattern was thus established. Night after night, the screams would come. Sometimes it was a single sharp cry. Other times it was a prolonged, desperate wail that seemed to go on for an eternity. Each time, they would find Nora in a state of abject terror, pointing to the same corner, describing the same grotesque woman, her skin like wet clay, and her dress like rotting rags. The narrative of the visitations began to accrue horrifying new details. Nora spoke of the woman's smell, which was growing stronger, a thick, cloying odor of damp soil and decay that she claimed now lingered in her room even after the woman was gone. She described the woman's whispers in greater detail, saying they were not just curses, but promises of a cold, dark place where no one would ever find her. The words, she said, were not meant to be understood by the ears, but felt directly by the heart, a chilling injection of despair. Each morning, Nora would try to explain it again, her small face etched with an earnest desperation to be believed, but her words were always met with the same wall of parental rationalization. It was her diet, perhaps, a story she had been told, the stress of the changing seasons. They cycled through every possible logical explanation, each one more strained than the last, because the alternative remained unthinkable. It was Elspeth who first began to see the cracks in their certainty, not because she was starting to believe in the phantom, but because she was beginning to see its undeniable effect on her daughter. The Nora, who came to the breakfast table each morning, was a pale, haunted version of her former self. Dark, bruised-looking circles had appeared beneath her eyes, a stark contrast to her translucent skin. Her movements became listless, her former childish energy drained away, replaced by a heavy, watchful exhaustion. She would sit for long periods, staring into space, her gaze often drifting toward the doorway that led to the hallway and her room beyond. Elspeth noticed that although they would often find Nora screaming in the night, ostensibly awake, the child seemed to have no true memory of their interventions the next day. She remembered the woman, the whispers, the terror, but she did not recall her parents bursting into the room or the comfort they tried to offer. It was as if she were experiencing two separate realities, one in the waking world of sunlight and porridge, and another in a nocturnal world of absolute horror, and the two were beginning to bleed into one another. A more disturbing change was in Nora's play. Her beloved collection of smooth, gray creek stones, once arranged in neat, orderly patterns on her windowsill, now lay in a chaotic jumble. She no longer seemed to take any comfort in their smooth, solid feel. One afternoon, Elspeth found her in her room, not playing with her dolls, but standing by the window, staring intently at the corner by the wardrobe. The sun was streaming into the room, illuminating every dust mote in the air, rendering the space as ordinary and non-threatening as any room in the house. Yet Nora stared at the empty corner as if she could see something there, her expression one of intense, fearful concentration. When Elspeth asked what she was looking at, Nora simply shook her head and turned away, a shudder falling behind her eyes. It was this, more than the nightly screams, that truly began to terrify Elspeth. The fear was no longer confined to the darkness. It was a presence that now inhabited her daughter's waking hours, a constant, silent companion. The house itself began to feel different. The settling groans of the timber frame, once a comforting and familiar sound, now seemed menacing in the deep quiet of the night. A floorboard creaking upstairs was no longer just a floorboard. It was a potential footstep. The rustle of wind in the oak tree outside Nora's window became a dry, scratching sound, unnervingly similar to the one her daughter had described. Elspeth found herself lying awake in her bed long after Thaddeus was asleep, straining her ears, listening for something beyond the normal nocturnal symphony of the old house. She was listening for whispers that may or may not exist, for a sound that her reason told her was impossible but that her maternal instinct was beginning to dread. She began to doubt her own senses, to question the very fabric of the reality she had always taken for granted. Was it possible that she was the one who was dreaming? Or, more terrifyingly, was it possible that she and Thaddeus were the only ones who were asleep, blind to the true nature of the darkness that had settled into the corner of their daughter's room? Thaddeus remained steadfast, his pragmatism a fortress against the encroaching dread. He saw his daughter's decline, but he attributed it to the psychological toll of her own delusions. He argued that the more they indulged these fantasies by rushing to her side, the more real they would become to her. The solution, he concluded, was not comfort, but a firm and undeniable demonstration of her safety. They needed to impose a physical barrier between the imagined threat and their child, a barrier whose logic was irrefutable. His idea was simple, and, to his mind, foolproof. He proposed that they begin locking Nora's bedroom door from the outside after she had fallen asleep. He explained his reasoning to a hesitant Elspeth. If the door was locked, he argued, then Nora's subconscious mind would be forced to accept her security. No one and nothing could get in. Furthermore, he added, It would prevent her from wandering the house if she was, as he suspected, having some form of night terror that caused her to wake and forget. It was an act of protection, he insisted, a rational shield against an irrational fear. Elspeth was deeply unsettled by the idea of locking their child in her room. It felt like an act of imprisonment, not of safety. But she was exhausted, frayed by the nightly assaults on her peace, and terrified by the slow, inexorable fading of her daughter. Her husband's certainty was an anchor in a rising tide of fear, and she found herself clinging to it. With a heavy heart, she agreed. They would try it. They would seal the room, and in doing so, they hoped to seal away the horror that had taken root within it. It was a decision born of desperation, a last, logical attempt to combat a terror that was proving to be anything but logical. They believed they were protecting Nora from her own mind, never once considering that they might be trapping her with something else entirely. The decision, once made, was carried out with the somber finality of a graveside commitment. That night, after Nora had succumbed to an uneasy sleep, Thaddeus and Elspeth stood outside her bedroom door in the dim, wavering light of a single candle. In his hand, Thaddeus held the heavy iron key. It was an old key, cold and pitted with age, belonging to a lock that had not been used in years. He inserted it into the keyhole, the scrape of metal on metal sounding unnaturally loud in the profound quiet of the house. The bolt shot home with a solid, definitive thud, a sound that seemed to echo not just in the hallway, but deep within Elspeth's own chest. It was the sound of a cage being sealed. For Thaddeus, the action brought a grim sense of resolution. He was imposing order, drawing a physical line that the chaos of the night could not cross. He was a carpenter, and this was an act of construction, building a wall of solid oak and forged iron around his daughter. He believed in the tangible world, and this locked door was a tangible fact. For Elspeth, the moment was one of pure, visceral wrongness. She watched the flame of the candle cast her husband's shadow, large and dark, against the locked door, and she felt a surge of what could only be described as dread. They were not shutting something out. They were sealing Nora in. The thought was immediate and chilling. She imagined her daughter waking in terror, running to the door only to find it barred against her, her panic compounding in the enclosed space. She saw the room not as a sanctuary, but as a potential prison, where Nora would be left utterly alone with her fears, real or imagined. She said nothing of this to Thaddeus. His jaw was set in a way she recognized, a mask of unyielding pragmatism that would brook no argument. They retreated to their own room, the silence between them heavy with their unspoken conflict. Thaddeus saw the lock as a solution. Elspeth feared it was a terrible mistake. They lay in their bed, staring into the darkness, and listened. But the house remained silent. For the first time in over a week, there were no screams. The next 2 nights passed in the same way, in a deep and unnerving stillness. The silence from Nora's room was a profound relief, yet it was not the peaceful, comforting silence they had once known. It was a weighted silence, an absence of sound that felt like a held breath. During the day, they watched their daughter for any sign of change. She remained pale and withdrawn, the dark circles under her eyes still a stark testament to her nightly ordeals. She did not mention the locked door, a fact that both relieved and unsettled them. It was as if she were either entirely unaware of it or unwilling to speak of it. Thaddeus took the quiet as proof that his method was working. He told Elspeth that the lock had provided a subconscious reassurance to Nora, proving to her dreaming mind that she was secure. His theory was that the very act of turning the key had broken the cycle of fear. Elspeth wanted to believe him. She clung to the evidence of the peaceful nights, allowing herself a fragile, tentative hope that the worst was over. The household began to exhale. The tension that had held them all in its grip for days started to loosen. They began to sleep more deeply, the exhaustion of the previous week finally catching up to them. They had confronted the irrational with the rational, and it seemed the rational had won. On the third night of the locked door, they were woken by a sound that tore their fragile peace to shreds. It was not the desperate, fearful cry of a child waking from a nightmare. It was something other, something that did not seem to belong to the human world at all. It was a scream of raw, unendurable agony, a sound of such pure and distilled torment that it seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the house. It was high and piercing, yet it had a guttural, tearing quality, as if it were being ripped from a throat not designed for such a noise. The sound went on, without pause for breath, a single, sustained note of absolute horror that clawed at their ears and seized their hearts in an icy grip. In that moment, all of Thaddeus's rational theories, all his carefully constructed certainties, were annihilated. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, his mind a maelstrom of primal fear. This was not the sound of a child's dream. It was the sound of something being broken. They scrambled down the short, dark hallway, Elspeth's hand pressed to her mouth to stifle her own cry of panic. The scream was still pouring from under the door, a physical presence in the narrow space, making the air feel thin and sharp. Thaddeus fumbled at his pocket for the key, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The key felt slick and foreign in his hand. He struggled to guide it into the keyhole, the metal scraping uselessly against the lock plate. The scream from within the room seemed to intensify, rising in pitch until it was a thin, unbearable shriek. He finally found the keyhole, turned the key, and threw the door open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall. And then, silence. A sudden, shocking, absolute cessation of all sound. The abrupt transition from the overwhelming noise to profound quiet was so disorienting that for a second they both stood frozen in the doorway, their senses reeling. The room was bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a full moon. The light slanted through the window, cutting a clean, silver rectangle across the floor and onto the far wall. Every object was in its place, rendered in shades of gray and black. The small wooden chair stood in the corner. Nora's corn-husk doll sat upon it, its painted-on smile placid and undisturbed. The collection of creek stones on the windowsill was a jumble of dark, silent shapes. The air was still and cool. There was no lingering smell of damp earth or decay. It was simply a child's room, silent and peaceful under the disinterested gaze of the moon. Their eyes, however, were fixed on the bed. There, in the center of the small mattress, lay Nora. She was on her back, the covers pulled neatly up to her chin. Her head was turned slightly to the side on the pillow, her straw-colored hair fanned out around her. Her breathing was slow, deep, and perfectly even. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight, was a mask of serene tranquility. There was no trace of fear, no sign of distress. Her lips were closed, softly parted, and from them came only the faint, rhythmic sound of a sleeping child's breath. Her eyes were shut. Elspeth moved first, her movements stiff and robotic. She drifted toward the bed as if in a trance, her mind unable to reconcile the sound she had just heard with the sight now before her. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on her daughter's forehead. The skin was cool and dry. Nora did not stir. She was not just asleep. She was in a state of deep, unreachable slumber. Elspeth looked back at Thaddeus, her face a canvas of utter bewilderment and terror. He remained in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the darkness of the hall. He was staring at his daughter, his expression one of dawning horror. This was not possible. The scream had been real. He had heard it. Elspeth had heard it. It had been the most terrible sound he had ever experienced. It had come from this room, from this child. Yet here she was, the very picture of innocence and peace, her body a silent, irrefutable contradiction to the evidence of their own ears. He stepped into the room and slowly, methodically, began to check it. He looked under the bed. He opened the tall wardrobe, its dark interior smelling only of cedar and old linen. He ran his hands along the walls, as if searching for a hidden speaker or some other trick. His actions were those of a man desperate to find a rational explanation, a tangible cause for the impossible effect he had just witnessed. But there was nothing. The room was a sealed container, the window latched from the inside, the door locked from the outside. There was no one and nothing there but their sleeping daughter. The silence in the room was now more terrifying than the scream had been. It was an accusatory silence, a void where reality should have been. It mocked their senses and dismantled their understanding of the world. They eventually retreated from the room, pulling the door closed but not daring to lock it again. They did not return to their bed. They sat at the small kitchen table in the dark, the moon casting long shadows across the floor, and for the first time, neither of them offered an explanation. There was none to be had. Thaddeus's fortress of pragmatism had been breached, its walls turned to dust. He could no longer claim it was a dream or a bid for attention. A dream did not end with the dreamer in a state of perfect peace. A cry for attention did not sound like a soul being torn apart. He was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, the compass of his reason shattered. He looked at his hands, the hands of a carpenter, hands that understood the logic of the physical world, and for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. He had heard what he had heard. He had seen what he had seen. The two truths could not coexist, and the paradox was a poison seeping into his mind. He and Elspeth were no longer observers of their daughter's fear. They were now full participants in the mystery. The question was no longer what was wrong with Nora. The question had become what was wrong with the house, with the night, with the very air they breathed. The locked door had not protected Nora. It had only served to prove, in the most terrifying way imaginable, that the source of the horror was not outside her room. It was already in there with her, and their own senses, their own grasp on what was real and what was not, were beginning to slip away. They were no longer trying to solve a problem. They were now waiting, in a state of shared, silent dread for what the next night would bring. Their doubt in Nora had been replaced by a chilling doubt in themselves. The day that followed was a long, silent ordeal. The sun rose into a sky of pale, indifferent blue, but its light did not seem to penetrate the gloom that had settled within the Haskett house. Thaddeus and Elspeth moved through their chores like automatons, the familiar rhythms of their life now a hollow pantomime of normalcy. They did not speak of what had happened the previous night. There were no words for it. To give it voice would be to grant it a reality they were not yet prepared to face. The experience existed between them as a shared, unspoken trauma, a memory so bizarre and terrifying that it had fractured the very foundation of their shared world. Thaddeus spent the morning in his workshop, but he did not work. He stood for a long time simply holding a piece of wood, feeling its grain and its solid, dependable weight, as if trying to reacquaint himself with the basic principles of a world that had suddenly become fluid and treacherous. He found no comfort in it. The logic of wood and measure was useless against the memory of that impossible scream followed by that impossible silence. Elspeth's day was a study in quiet, creeping terror. Every shadow in the house seemed deeper, every random creak of the floorboards a potential omen. She watched Nora with a new kind of attention, a mixture of profound love and a dawning, terrible fear. Her daughter was no longer just her child. She was an enigma, a vessel for a mystery that was far beyond her comprehension. Nora herself seemed to be receding further from them. She ate little, spoke not at all, and spent most of the day sitting by the window in her room, her gaze fixed on the corner by the wardrobe. She was not playing, not reading, not engaging with the world in any discernible way. She was simply waiting. Her stillness was the stillness of a deep sea, calm on the surface but concealing unknowable pressures and life forms in its depths. Elspeth felt an overwhelming urge to snatch her daughter up and flee the house, to run until the oppressive atmosphere of the place was a distant memory. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the thing they feared was not in the house. It was with Nora. There was nowhere to run. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, a new and palpable tension settled over the family. The approach of night was no longer a promise of rest, but a summons to a vigil. They ate their evening meal in near total silence, the scraping of forks against plates the only sound. After, they did not retire to the parlor. Thaddeus did not read his newspaper, and Elspeth did not take up her mending. They simply sat at the kitchen table, the unlit lamp between them, and waited as the last of the day's light failed. This time, there was no discussion of locking the door. The lock had been a monument to their own ignorance, a foolish attempt to bar a door against a threat that was already inside. They would not make that mistake again. They did not even bother making a pretense of going to bed. They remained at the table, two silent sentinels in the heart of their home, their senses strained, listening to the deepening silence of the night. Every gust of wind, every skittering mouse in the walls, was a source of alarm. They were learning a new language, the language of fear, where every sound was a potential syllable in a sentence of damnation. The hours crawled by. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10, then 11. The house was as still as a tomb. Then, just before the stroke of midnight, a sound came from Nora's room. It was not the raw, agonized scream of the night before. It was something far stranger, and in its own way, more disturbing. It was a low, guttural cry, strained and rhythmic, like someone attempting to lift an immense and crushing weight. It was a sound of profound effort, punctuated by sharp, ragged gasps for air. It was a sound that was both human and not, a vocalization that seemed to scrape its way out of Nora's small throat, distorted and unnatural. It was not a cry of fear. It was a cry of exertion, of struggle, of some terrible and private labor. Thaddeus and Elspeth looked at each other across the darkened kitchen, their faces pale masks of dread in the moonlight. This was new. This was different. Without a word, they rose from their chairs and moved, as one, toward the source of the sound. They reached her door and paused, their hands hovering over the latch. The strained, rhythmic sounds from within continued, a low, constant moaning that seemed to make the very wood of the door vibrate. This time, there was no hesitation born of disbelief, only the cold, hard certainty that they were about to step into a reality they were not equipped to understand. Thaddeus pushed the door open. They did not burst in this time. They opened it slowly, cautiously, as if expecting to be met with a physical blow. The room was again lit by the stark, silver light of the moon, which had risen high in the sky. The scene that met their eyes was one of utter, surreal horror, a tableau of impossible stillness and terrifying implication. Nora was not in her bed. She was standing upon it. She stood perfectly erect in the very center of the mattress, her small, bare feet planted firmly on the woolen coverlet. Her body was rigid, her muscles taut, as if under some immense physical strain. Her nightgown, a simple garment of white cotton, hung limply around her thin frame, but it was her arms that commanded their attention, that held them paralyzed in the doorway. Both of her arms were raised straight up toward the ceiling, her fingers splayed wide, as if reaching for something, or holding something up. Her posture was not one of supplication. It was one of support, as if she were a single, small column bearing an unimaginable and invisible load. Her head was thrown back, her throat exposed, and her eyes were open, fixed on a point on the ceiling directly above her. It was not a vacant stare. Her gaze was one of intense, unwavering focus, as if she were looking at something of immense and terrible significance. But there was nothing there. The ceiling was a simple expanse of plaster, cracked with age, its surface illuminated by the cool, unforgiving light of the moon. There were no shadows, no shapes, nothing to command such rapt and terrified attention. Yet, as Thaddeus and Elspeth stared, their own eyes following their daughter's gaze, they began to feel it. It was a palpable sensation, a change in the very atmosphere of the room. The air directly above Nora seemed heavier, denser, as if the space itself were being compressed by an unseen mass. They felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness, a pocket of chill that seemed to emanate downward from that empty point on the ceiling. The shadows in the corners of the room, which had seemed ordinary moments before, now appeared to warp and deepen, to stretch and pull toward the space above the bed, as if drawn in by a silent, invisible gravity. Nora's lips were moving. They formed silent, repetitive shapes, though no sound escaped them. The strained, guttural cries had ceased the moment the door had opened. Now, there was only this profound, unnerving silence, and the sight of their daughter, standing on her bed, her small arms holding up the sky. She seemed entirely unaware of their presence. She was locked in a private, terrifying communion with the emptiness above her. Thaddeus felt a primitive, paternal urge to rush forward, to snatch his daughter from the bed and break the strange, hypnotic spell that held her. But he could not move. His feet felt as though they were nailed to the floorboards. He was held in place by a force more powerful than his own will, a feeling of profound and sacred dread, a sense that he was an intruder in a ritual he could not comprehend. To interfere, his instincts screamed, would be to invite a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Elspeth stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Tears were streaming down her face, but she made no sound. She was witnessing the transformation of her child into something alien, a living idol in a profane ceremony. The girl on the bed was her daughter, but she was also a stranger, a participant in a horror that was taking place on a plane of existence entirely separate from their own. The room, which had once been a place of safety in childhood dreams, had become an altar, and their daughter was the sacrifice. They could only stand and watch, two helpless witnesses to a silent, terrifying transaction, their own world dissolving around them as they stared at the invisible weight their daughter held up in the cold, silent moonlight. They did not retreat from their daughter's room. To leave her in that state, a small, rigid vessel communing with an invisible horror, felt like a profound and final act of abandonment. Thaddeus, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror he could not begin to process, gently took Nora's shoulders and guided her to a sitting position on the bed. The moment his hands made contact, the tension in her small frame seemed to dissolve, and she collapsed against him, her body limp and heavy, like a doll whose strings had been cut. She was not conscious. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Elspeth pulled the covers around her, her hands moving with a desperate, practiced tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the surreal nature of the situation. They sat on either side of her on the small bed, a silent, helpless honor guard, and watched her through what remained of the night. They did not speak. The experience had taken them beyond the realm where language had any meaning. They were adrift in a shared nightmare, the familiar geography of their lives rendered alien and menacing. The moonlight eventually faded from the floorboards, replaced by the thin, gray light of a false dawn. The world outside was beginning to stir, but within the Haskett house, a profound and terrible stillness had taken hold. The day was an exercise in suspended reality. Nora did not wake in any conventional sense. She remained in a deep, trance-like state, her body pliant but unresponsive. Elspeth bathed her and dressed her as if she were an infant, her heart aching with a grief so deep it felt like a physical wound. The child she tended to was her daughter in form, but the animating spirit, the bright and curious consciousness that was Nora, was absent. It was as if the vessel were still there, but its occupant had been hollowed out, replaced by a silent, watchful vacancy. Thaddeus, for his part, could not stay in the house. The sight of his daughter in that state was a torment that drove him out into the cold morning air. He walked the perimeter of his property, his gaze sweeping over the familiar lines of his home, the sturdy timbers he had shaped and joined with his own hands. The house no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a tomb. His pragmatism, the bedrock of his identity, had been pulverized. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with logic and with force. But what was he to do against an enemy he could not see, a force that could make his daughter stand on her bed and hold up the sky? He was left with nothing but a terrible, impotent rage and a fear that was so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. As evening approached, the tension that had defined the previous night returned, but it was transformed. The frenetic anxiety had curdled into a kind of grim, exhausted resignation. They knew it would happen again. They did not know what form it would take, but they understood, with a certainty that had settled deep in their bones, that the night belonged to the thing in Nora's room. They were merely spectators. They did not bother with the pretense of a meal. They sat once more in the kitchen, in the encroaching darkness, and they listened. The house itself seemed to be listening with them, every timber and joist holding its breath in anticipation. The normal sounds of the evening were gone. There were no crickets, no rustle of leaves in the oak tree. There was only a heavy, expectant silence, a silence that felt like the pause before a final, terrible pronouncement. They were waiting for a verdict that had, in truth, already been delivered. They were simply waiting to see the sentence carried out. It began just as the clock in the hall was striking midnight. It was not a single sound, but a horrifying chord of noise that erupted from Nora's room and washed over the house. It was a sound that defied all natural law, a sound that should not have been possible. It was Nora's voice, thin and high, stretched to a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. But woven through it, around it, was another voice. It was a dry, rasping sound, a guttural and ancient articulation that was less a voice and more a geological event. It was the sound of gravel being poured into a grave, of old bones being ground to dust, of a throat that had not known moisture for 1,000 years. The two sounds twisted together, a hideous duet of childlike fear and primeval malice. Nora's screams were punctuated by the other voices' low, sibilant whispers, forming a chaotic, terrifying harmony. It was the sound of a struggle, of a soul being unraveled thread by thread. Thaddeus and Elspeth were propelled from their chairs not by a conscious decision, but by a shared, instinctual jolt of horror. They ran down the hallway, their hearts hammering against their ribs, the terrible, mingled sound growing louder with every step, seeming to come from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Thaddeus threw the door open, his entire body braced for the sight that would await them, and yet, no amount of preparation could have shielded them from the reality of it. The scene was one of quiet, impossible levitation. Nora was suspended in the exact center of the room. She was not rising, not falling. She was simply held, her body hanging in the air as if she were a specimen pinned to a collector's board. She was a full 5 feet off the ground, her small form silhouetted against the pale moonlight that streamed through the window behind her. Her limbs were not flailing, nor were they limp. They were arranged in a posture of serene, horrifying stillness. Her arms were held slightly out from her sides, her palms turned upward. Her legs were together, her bare feet pointing gracefully downward. Her head was tilted back slightly, her face turned toward the ceiling, but her eyes were closed. The mingled screams had stopped the instant the door had opened, replaced once more by that profound, unnatural silence. The only sound in the room was the frantic, ragged sound of their own breathing. She was unreachable. The height at which she was suspended was just beyond their grasp. Thaddeus, a tall man, would have had to jump to even brush her dangling feet with his fingertips. She was on display, a deliberate and theatrical presentation designed to showcase her complete and utter helplessness, and by extension, their own. The air in the room was thick and cold, heavy with a pressure that seemed to be emanating from Nora herself, or rather, from the empty space that surrounded her. The faint, cloying smell of damp earth and decay was back, stronger than ever before, a nauseating miasma that filled their lungs and coated their tongues. They could see her lips. They were moving, a slow, rhythmic, and deliberate motion. It was not the frantic movement of someone in distress. It was the calm, measured movement of conversation. She was answering. She was responding to questions they could not hear, posed by a partner they could not see. Her face, in the moonlight, was a placid and emotionless mask. The terror of the screams was gone, replaced by a profound and chilling emptiness. She was no longer fighting. She was complying. In that moment, Thaddeus understood. The woman Nora had described, the grotesque figure with skin like clay and a dress of rags, was there. He could not see her, but he could feel her presence as a palpable weight, a distortion in the fabric of the room. She was the one holding Nora. She was the one asking the questions. The invisible force that held his daughter aloft was the physical manifestation of this entity's will. All of his life, he had believed only in what he could see and touch, in the solid, irrefutable laws of the world. Now, he was staring at the utter annihilation of those laws. His daughter was floating in the air, held in the unseen grasp of a creature from a child's nightmare, a nightmare that had turned out to be devastatingly real. He felt his knees weaken, the strength draining from his body, replaced by a cold, hollowing despair. Elspeth stood beside him, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was beyond tears, beyond screams. She was watching the final, irreversible act of her daughter being claimed. The child she had birthed, nursed, and loved was being stolen from her, not by sickness or by accident, but by an ancient and predatory darkness that had crawled out of a forgotten corner of the world and into her home. They were no longer parents trying to comfort a frightened child. They were witnesses to an ascension, a terrible and unholy sacrament. And all they could do was stand there, frozen in the doorway, and watch as their daughter, suspended in the cold moonlight, drifted further and further away from them, her lips still moving, answering a voice that no one else could hear. There was no clear end to the event. There was no climactic confrontation, no final, terrible vanishing. At some unknown point in the deep, silent hours of the morning, as Thaddeus and Elspeth stood like statues of salt in the doorway, paralyzed by a horror that had stripped them of will and reason, Nora began to descend. Her descent was not a fall. It was a slow, controlled, and unnervingly graceful lowering, as if she were being placed back into her world by a pair of vast and careful hands. She was set down upon the center of her bed with a delicacy that was profoundly obscene, a final, mocking gesture of care from the entity that had claimed her. The moment her feet touched the mattress, her body went limp, and she collapsed onto her side, curled into a fetal position, her silent, conversational lips finally still. The oppressive weight in the air, the chilling cold, the thick, cloying smell of the grave, all of it vanished in an instant. The atmosphere in the room simply returned to normal, as if a switch had been thrown, leaving behind only the still, silent form of their daughter and the two shattered witnesses in the doorway. The sun that rose the next morning was an offense, a garish and unwelcome intrusion into the private, hermetic world of their grief. They had not moved from the room, had not slept. They had spent the remaining hours of darkness sitting on the floor, their backs against the wall, watching their daughter's still form as if they expected her to either evaporate with the morning mist or rise again into the air. When the first tentative rays of sunlight crept across the floorboards, they revealed a scene of chilling, domestic banality. The room was utterly undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no physical trace of the terrible power that had been unleashed within its walls. The corn-husk doll sat placidly on its chair. The jumble of smooth gray stones lay on the windowsill, catching the morning light. It was just a room. The ordinariness of it was a form of madness, a quiet, insistent denial of the reality they had witnessed with their own eyes. It was the room's silence, its simple, unviolated state, that was the most damning evidence of all. It suggested that the horror had not been an invasion, but a manifestation, something that had always been latent within the space, and had now simply receded back into the plaster and the floorboards, waiting. When Nora finally opened her eyes, there was no recognition in them. There was no fear, no memory of the night's ordeal, no sign of the bright, inquisitive child they had known. Her eyes, once a serious but watchful blue, were now flat and placid, like the surface of a stagnant pool of water. They looked at her parents, but they did not seem to see them. It was the gaze of a person looking at a familiar piece of furniture, an object whose presence was noted, but whose significance was lost. Elspeth spoke her name, her voice a raw, broken whisper. The girl on the bed turned her head toward the sound, a slow, mechanical motion, but her expression did not change. The name, Nora, seemed to hold no meaning for her. She was a flawless, empty vessel. The girl who had collected stones, who had told stories to her dolls, who had cried out in terror in the night, was gone. In her place was this silent, beautiful, and utterly unreachable shell. They moved through the days that followed in a thick, suffocating fog of disbelief. The new reality of their lives was a quiet, relentless horror. Nora was not sick in any way a doctor could diagnose. She was not catatonic. She would move when guided, eat when a spoon was brought to her lips, and sit for hours in any chair she was placed in. But she initiated nothing. She expressed nothing. She was a living ghost in their home, her silence a constant, screaming testament to the thing they had seen. The bond between parent and child, once the central pillar of their existence, was gone, replaced by the one-sided, heartbreaking duty of a caretaker tending to a stranger. Elspeth would brush her daughter's long, straw-colored hair, her hands moving with a tenderness that was now a form of pure, unrequited love. She would speak to her, telling her stories of their life before, of picnics by the creek and the warmth of the kitchen on baking day, hoping that a word, a memory, might snag on something within the vast emptiness and pull the real Nora back to the surface. But her words fell into a void. Nora's placid, empty gaze never wavered. Thaddeus was a man being methodically dismantled from the inside out. His world of reason and tangible proof had been razed to the ground. He now lived in a world where the impossible was not only possible, but had taken up residence in his home. He would sometimes go into Nora's room when she was not there, and simply stand in the center of it, staring up at the ceiling, trying to feel some remnant of the presence, some lingering coldness or pressure in the air. He needed a physical anchor for his memory, something to prove to his own fracturing mind that he had not imagined it all. But there was nothing. The room remained stubbornly, infuriatingly normal. The corner by the wardrobe was just a corner. The ceiling was just plaster. His inability to find any physical evidence of the event began to feel like a personal torment, a calculated cruelty designed to make him doubt his own sanity. The memory of his daughter, suspended in the air, her lips moving in silent conversation, was burned onto the back of his eyes. It was the most real thing he had ever seen, and yet the world around him conspired to deny it at every turn. The silence between Thaddeus and Elspeth was the most profound change of all. They had once been partners, sharing the small joys and quiet burdens of their life. Now, they were two isolated islands of grief, separated by an ocean of unspeakable truth. They could not talk about it. What was there to say? How could they begin to articulate the sight of their daughter hanging in the air? To speak the words aloud would be to admit a final, terrible defeat, to acknowledge that they were living in a reality governed by the laws of a malevolent fairy tale. So they did not speak of it. They communicated in gestures and brief, necessary phrases related to the running of the household, but the shared memory was a constant presence between them, a third person at their dinner table, a cold and invisible form in their bed at night. They no longer dismissed what Nora had tried to tell them. They now carried the burden of that knowledge themselves, but in a terrible, tragic irony, their belief had come too late. It had arrived only after the thing they now believed in had finished its work. The story, as it must, eventually leached out beyond the walls of the Haskett home, but it did so in a corrupted, incomplete form. Neighbors noticed the family's withdrawal from the community, the drawn curtains, the untended garden. They saw Elspeth in town, her face a pale, haunted mask, and they saw Thaddeus, a man who seemed to have aged a decade in a matter of weeks. And they saw Nora, on the rare occasions she was taken outside, a beautiful, silent girl with empty eyes, led by the hand like a toddler. Whispers began. The townsfolk, lacking the horrifying truth, invented their own. They spoke of a sudden, tragic illness, a wasting fever that had stolen the child's mind. They speculated about some hidden madness in the family line, a dark seed that had finally sprouted in the third generation. The Haskett house, once a symbol of modest, respectable virtue, slowly transformed in the local imagination into a place of sorrow and shadow. The truth, in all its impossible, terrifying detail, remained locked inside, a secret kept by two broken parents and their silent, unreachable child. They never learned what was in the room, or why it had chosen Nora. There was no explanation, no resolution, no moment of clarifying insight. The entity, the grotesque woman from Nora's first, terrified descriptions, had come, had taken what it wanted, and had departed, leaving behind only a hollowed-out child and the enduring mystery of its purpose. Was it a demon, a spirit, a being from some forgotten folklore? Was its goal the consumption of a child's soul, or was it something far stranger, a process of transformation for some unknowable end? These were the questions that would haunt Thaddeus and Elspeth for the rest of their lives. They were the questions that festered in the silence of their home, in the empty gaze of their daughter. The horror was not in a final, bloody confrontation, but in the complete and utter absence of answers. The story of Nora Haskett does not end with a period. It ends with a question mark that hangs, invisible and eternal, in the still, heavy air of an ordinary room in a quiet corner of Ohio, a room that now feels haunted forever. The record on Nora Haskett is complete, and your presence through its final page means more than you know. If you have just found our channel, subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive so you are here when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments how this story spoke to you.